our story. Today we have with us a very special guest. We have joining us Vlada Glan. She is a international political strategist. She's also the managing director at Actum, which is a consultancy company based in the US. But Vlada is by origin, she's a Ukrainian, and she has been there in and out of Ukraine even during the war. And welcome to this conversation, Vlada. And first of all, I would really like your help in helping us understand what is happening in Ukraine. When did you last visit?
Thank you so much, Priya, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just in Ukraine on Friday, about 2 weeks ago, before I was in Delhi, and the situation is constantly changing on the ground. I'm originally from Ukraine. I have a home in Kiev. I was born in Odessa, Ukraine, and my father is currently still in Odessa, Ukraine, and he's serving with other civilians to support the war efforts. I had to immigrate my brother, who's 19 years old, and bring him out of the country. The situation is just getting more dire on the ground, and now we're in war mode. It's been a year of war now, and while we've held on and made incredible gains and strides, this effort has been incredibly destructive financially. You can never replace lives or infrastructure in this period of time and what we've lost over a year.
No, I also know that you've been trying to raise money for support for people back home in Ukraine. But your father, he's a civilian. So there is conscription in the state also. People, the war is not just a military war. Now it's, the civilians are involved as well. That is the level that is there.
Yes, there's many civilians that have been damaged during this effort and have been affected. Civilian infrastructure has been affected. Hospitals, kindergartens, schools, all of this has been heavily affected. The destruction is huge. $750 billion that you have in damage just to infrastructure alone, not to mention the civilian casualties that this war has seen. There has been thousands and thousands of war crimes that have been reported. And this is affecting the civilian population. I don't think that we often think of what happens to civilians in these situations, but the destruction and the damage has been devastating, specifically to civilian infrastructure. That is what has suffered the absolute most. We have children that are orphans now, many refugees that have been forced to flee the country that are outside of the country now or displaced within Ukraine.
Yeah, in fact, this has really sparked Europe's biggest refugee crisis also. So just the lives and the individual stories matter. But as we speak, I think there is action at Bakhmut. Have I pronounced it right?
Yes, you have.
Bakhmut. So Putin, of course, is putting a whole lot of symbolic pressure on this. And, how decisive would a Russian win in Bakhmut be from your point of view? Can you tell us a bit about the town? It's in southeast Ukraine.
Yes, Bakhmut is not a very large town, but I think what's symbolic about this town, just from the Ukrainian perspective, is the fact that the Russians have spent months and months on end and resources, how much artillery fire, how many resources they have used in this small town tells you at what a struggle Russia is. And if Russia cannot win Bakhmut and cannot take Bakhmut, it says a lot for the way in the trajectory that this war is going for them. If the Russians manage to take Bakhmut, well, it's been months and months of them flooding resources into it. So I think for them, of course, it would be a victory. Would it be a decisive victory? No, it's a small town. But I think what's symbolic on the Ukrainian side is that the Ukrainians have been brilliant in strategy in managing to drain Russian resources into a smaller town and in a smaller surrounding villages, having them waste all of their manpower and military and resources. This was also an area where the Wagner group had a lot of resources placed in some of their higher level personnel and more trained soldiers. And you've seen how much they have struggled to take control, even with that level on the ground of weapons and of personnel. And it goes to really tell you the kind of effort and the kind of fight that Ukraine has has put up as being an underdog in this fight and a David versus the Goliath.
In fact, I don't think Russia also expected the war to last so long. But before we talk about, a little, I would also like your help in understanding how it all began. I want to first look forward as to how it may end. We had the Russian foreign minister in India also. He spoke at the Raisina dialogue and for the G20 meet. And he's been saying that, any kind of negotiated settlement doesn't arise because of Zelensky's views. He's made it negotiating with Russia under Putin a criminal offense. So that takes off negotiations off the table as far as Russia is concerned.
Well, at the end of the day, what you have with Russia is if we're going to come to the table and come to a dialogue, there first has to be a complete and total ceasefire. You cannot negotiate terms of peace with a gun to Ukraine's head. This is just not the reality, and it's just not possible. And what you have to have is a serious level of talks and dialogues at the bilateral level, head of state to head of state level. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to be able to sit down and talk peace. And what you're going to need in this equation is other decision-making countries that are very heavily involved to be on board. And India plays a significant role in this, in my opinion. On the Ukrainian side, you may have a United States or a United Kingdom or a France as an ally in these negotiations and talks on the Ukrainian side. On the Russian side, I think it's natural to assume that China would be on its side. But India finds itself in a unique position as being able to really play a role in between both sides. India can be one of, a few honest brokers in this equation. It's no lie that India has had relations with Russia since the early 1990s. But India also has fought and understands colonialization, colonial powers, and imperialism. And Russia, at the end of the day, is an imperialist state. And Prime Minister Modi has publicly called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And while he hasn't taken some kind of firm public position, it's understandable why, because at the end of the day, India is incredibly dependent on Russian oil. India finds itself in a position where it is a huge consumer and doesn't produce a lot of oil. So it is heavily dependent on Russian oil. But in order for a dialogue and a peace talk to take place, you need a lot of power brokers at the table, a lot of international actors. India can be one of them. And this takes up conversation bilaterally at the head of state level. Part of that conversation means that going into these talks, Russia has to agree to remove all of its troops from Ukrainian territory. This is really non-negotiable. On the Ukrainian side, Ukraine is probably going to have to have a pause when it comes to conversations of accession to the EU or NATO. This is one of these terms that they're both going to have to come into a conversation with all cards on the table. And this is what it will take to start the conversations for peace.
So do you think even today, 1 year into the war, if India takes the initiative and appeals to both Russia and Ukraine, would, say, the Ukrainian president be ready to come to the table under Indian leadership?
Absolutely. I believe that Ukraine is ready for a solution for peace, but peace under what terms? Ukraine will not come to the table if we're talking about giving up half of Ukrainian territory or 30% of Ukrainian territory. But if we remove all conditions for peace talks to take place and we come to the table in an honest engagement and dialogue, I do not think that the Ukrainian people nor the leadership in Ukraine or President Zelenskyy would object to India's involvement. In fact, I think that India has one of the fastest growing economies in the world. We look to countries like India to step up to the plate and to play a role in this process.
During your visit to Delhi just recently, what was the feedback that you got? You met a lot of other experts, not just, the diplomats, but you did mingle with a lot of people.
I think it's undeniable when you travel to India and when you're at these international dialogues to see both sides at play here. You cannot deny the connection and the history that the Indian population has with Russia. But at the same time, you cannot deny that the Indian people do not want war. They do not want to see people suffering. And that's the sentiment that you see over and over again. Not to mention that you see kind of a switch after a year of war. Everybody has a significant desire to see some kind of peaceful solution. India is affected by global rising food prices and cost of oil and grain. They are undoubtedly affected. And this is not a short run game. This is a long run game. And within another year, we cannot afford to have such a conflict. The Indian people will feel it much more. And you can see growing concern and desire from India to kind of see an end to this war. I truly believe that the Indian people ask the question of, why is this our problem to fix? Why do we get involved now? Where was Europe when we needed Europe to support us? But at the end of the day, it's now been a year, and it's undeniable how this is affecting countries all over the globe, a lot of developing nations, but particularly affecting India. And I think that there is a true desire, and what I felt in Delhi, to see this war come to an end, and even talks of how India could be part of that solution. And we'd certainly love to see that.
Well, we do hope that the Indian leadership is listening to this. But a little bit about, if you can explain the context of the war to us, how it all began, from a little bit of research, we can trace it back to the separatist movement in Donbass. There is, of course, NATO, being, say, co-opted by NATO's role coming in and trying to get Ukraine to join NATO, while Russia, of course, wants a closer tie with Ukraine. Just explain the whole thing to us as to how do you think what is the heart of the problem?
For years and years and years, Russia has had a hard time letting go of any of the former Soviet states. But if you understand the history of the Ukrainian people, of what is modern day now the Ukrainian culture, Kiev existed, our capital, almost 1,000 years before Moscow ever existed as a city. We have an incredible history, and most people only understand the Soviet history of our countries. Russia has always struggled post-Soviet Union and the fall of the Soviet Union to controlling the Soviet states. But Ukraine is an independent sovereign nation and has made a decision as a country and as a people to start moving closer to the EU. Now, that's not to be mistaken for the fact that we were running for EU membership or running to join NATO. In fact, that's just not the case. And that's an argument that Russia has repeatedly made. As many European states who've been through it understand, accession to the EU and to NATO is a years and years long process and battle, and requires quite a bit of work, especially on the NATO side. In order to be prepared to join NATO as a country, you really have to up the standards militarily in the country in a massive fashion. And most people think that this can happen in a short period of time, overnight, a year, 2 years. That is just not the case. But ever since Ukraine has fought in Euromaidan, which took place before the first war with Russia, and said that we want to go towards the path of EU over time, Russia has come in and started invading Ukraine. And one of the key notes that they've used and points that they've stressed multiple times, and Lavrov stated this at the Raisina dialogues in Delhi. I was there, I heard it, was language. He talked about language and how the Ukrainian people are being prevented from speaking Russian, and how Russian language is being banned, and they're being attacked and oppressed for it. But I, sitting before you today, am a prime example. I'm a Russian speaker. I come from a city that for years was a very predominantly Russian speaking city. I understand Ukrainian poorly and speak broken Ukrainian. So So that argument just doesn't stand. My grandmother is the same as me. And it's unfortunate that these kind of rhetoric and this kind of precursor is being used to justify a war. Russia says that it was threatened and its security is being threatened by the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. Yet at the same time, Russia is bordered by other NATO nations. And so it's just not accurate. We fought this war. Russia, claims that they're, separatists that they were just supporting, but it was Russian troops inside of our country. It was all Russian backed from the beginning, fighting this war since 2014 for years. And in fact, it's very interesting to note that the last Ukrainian soldier that passed away from the war in 2014 was 2020. And here we go again. Before we've even managed to end the last war with Russia, they've come back again because they just cannot let go of Ukraine. They want Ukraine to be like a Belarus, a country that can be controlled and manipulated, having a president like Lukashenko under its reach and under its grasp, supporting all of their movements. But the Ukrainian people have gone through 2 revolutions and they've made their voices heard. We are willing to fight for our land. In 2014, when the Russians illegally took Crimea, the Ukrainian people were ready to fight then. And we had this war for years on our borders. And everybody says, give up territory and, maybe there can be a peace. But guess what? We lost territory once already, and there has been no peace. And so we cannot let an aggressor state get away with this. Why? Because what precedent does it set to any country in the world, including India? That means what? That means that you can have a country come in to a sovereign state, seize territory, and there's no real punishment for it. And this is a point that actually Secretary Blinken made at the Raisina dialogues, is saying that if Russia is allowed to move forward with this, what precedent do we set on an international stage for other aggressor states? This is a very dangerous precedent, and this war has started from those kind of roots of Russia's desire to contain control and to continue being an imperial power. You saw this in Georgia, you've seen this in Syria, you're seeing this in Ukraine, and this is a pattern, unfortunately, that's not going to stop. But the buck stops with Ukraine. We are willing to fight for our land, and I think that we've proven a worthy adversary in this fight.
That no arguments. But to which the foreign minister Lavrov also pointed out in his same visit to India, that he says, there is a certain kind of hypocrisy from the West. When there was action in Iraq, when there was action in Serbia, bombing in Serbia, no one else reacted. Just because Russians have had military action in Ukraine, there is this huge outcry. So is there a them versus us kind of a dialogue that Russia is trying to build up a narrative?
Well, this is typical propaganda that Lavrov is known for in Russia.
Right?
But to get to your point, we have a very different situation in the United States. We didn't go into these countries from the United States perspective from nothing. There was a strong belief in weapons of mass destruction. If you will recall, on September 11th, there was a terrorist plane that hit the Twin Towers and had one of the largest terrorist attacks in the history of the United States with the largest amount of casualties. War does not start from nothing, and you for Russia to cite this is only its own excuse into conquering us absolutely sovereign state. The United States doesn't negotiate with terrorists. It doesn't tolerate terrorism, and it fights terrorism on the global level for the world. And this is not just a U.S. effort. This is a global effort to fight terrorism. India is familiar with this fight. India has been part of the fight in fighting terrorism. And so this is a very different kind of equation, but he naturally wants to draw parallels to any kind of war scenario.
Yeah, I'm going to take a quick break and come back and keep the conversation going. And I want to broaden the spectrum a bit also because we have with us an international political strategist. So a bit about the diplomatic language. Is there been a ratcheting on the discourse? We have now people not hesitating. Early on it was always in velvet gloves, but I think the nuances are off and now people are talking more directly. And is this really a sign of the times? Just after a quick break. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation. We're in conversation with Vlada Glan. She is international political strategist and the managing director at Actum, a consultancy company based in the US. Vlada, we were discussing the Ukrainian war, or rather the military invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But we've been hearing people talk about, and since you've been following events closely, you're an international strategist. Is there ratcheting up of dialogue also? Early on, diplomatic language was just that, it was diplomatic, but now I think it's very blunt, very straightforward, and there seems to be, is this a sign of the times that more straight talk, more name calling, more I don't know what to say, less diplomacy?
Well, I think that we have to address the situation for what it is, and this was a very dangerous situation where an absolutely sovereign nation was unjustifiably invaded for arguments and points that have no legal standing, and now we have international investigations going into war crimes, civilians dying every day. So, of course, there's now a year into this war. We're in war mode, and it's time for straight talk. I think that we've diplomatically walked very carefully and tiptoed around many subjects that we can no longer afford to do anymore. The world is suffering. You're going to see shortages across the African continent as food prices soar. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are some of the largest supporters, providers of wheat to the world. Wheat, grain, we are the breadbasket. Russia and Ukraine are the breadbasket of the world. And so I think that you can no longer afford to have very careful discussions. They must be much more blunt as we are looking at the fact that this is can create a global crisis, which we've already started feeling the effects of. And God forbid, there's not a solution to this war this year. Next year, the developing world is going to feel these effects in a very, very serious way. So yes, it's time for straight talk, and it's time for direct dialogue at a bilateral level.
Okay. And also, what do you make of Putin? He's always he's building this up to be a war against neo-Nazi forces. I mean, it's understandable why Russia would look to World War II and not World War I, because they didn't do so well in World War I. But the whole imagery that he's trying to create, what is your comment on that?
I think this is a wonderful question, and I'm a Ukrainian Jew from the city of Odessa. There are many, many like me, including our president, whose own family survived the Holocaust. And I think it is a complete propaganda narrative, just like many of the other narratives that we've seen come out of Russia. Ukraine had some of the largest Jewish population, especially my hometown of Odessa. And so you are fighting Nazis, yet many of us are Jews. And I think it is such a shame that we've been allowed to kind of let them propagate this narrative. At the end of the day, there were many Ukrainians and Ukrainian nationals that were a huge part in helping rescue Jews. Could we have done more? Yes. I think Poland will tell you that they could have also done more. There's many countries that could have done more during World War II. But to say that we are Nazis and that you are fighting Nazism and fascism is just a shame, because the real parallel here is that it is more of Putin that has been acting like Nazi leadership and can even and often is paralleled to Hitler. Putin right now is traveling by train because he's scared of flying. This is exactly what happened very parallel to Adolf Hitler towards the end. And it's really, really a shame because it is exactly propaganda like Russia's propaganda that you saw in Germany during World War II. And it's very, very, very dangerous because we know what happened in Germany in World War II. And we do not want to allow anything on that scale or magnitude to happen with Ukraine.
How much is Zelensky's own personality at the heart of this matter? Because, there is that narrative that he's been propped up by the West. There is also the very influential Jewish lobby in the West that, would be looking out for his interests. That is the Russian narrative saying that, he is just a puppet of NATO and the Western world. And anybody else but him, the things wouldn't have been so bad.
The reality is that Zelenskyy has been an incredibly strong world wartime leader. And he has stepped up to the plate in an incredible way without having a large political gravitas from his previous career transitioning into politics. The problem that Russia made when Zelenskyy came into power is they thought that because he lacked some sort of political gravitas from his former career, that they could bully him into the position they wanted. And he proved that that was not the case, because at the end of the day, if Ukraine wants to flex its muscle, it has a lot of strong allies. And at that point, when Russia overplayed its hand, trying and attempting to bully Ukraine and President Zelenskyy, at this point, you saw a very huge dynamic political shift because they overplayed their hand and the West came in to support Ukraine. But the fighting that's happened on the ground has been the Ukrainian people, and you cannot fight against the spirit of Ukraine. For us, it's almost a holy war. We are fighting to keep the existence of Ukraine and to keep our land. Many Russians don't understand why they are fighting. And so, to answer your question, President Zelenskyy has more than stepped up to the plate, but Russia made the mistake believing that they could bully him. And he proved that not only is he up for the task, but we have a lot of strong friends that have come to the table.
Just one last question before I let you go. We've been talking about how this is part of one of the biggest refugee crises. They have to cross, I think, borders filled with minefields. How does that work?
In the early days, when there was a mass exodus out of the country and a fleeing for the borders and fear for security, it was mainly women and children. The waits at the borders were 2, 3, 4 days long. That's since then, since a year of this war, that's significantly decreased. Many people illegally escaped the country, crossing minefields at borders, navigating, and getting out in any way that they could. We've now seen quite a shift in the capital of Kiev. Many of the residents have returned, but that's not to say that it's completely safe. We've just managed to hold Kiev firmly. Kiev is incredibly secure, but you still hear sirens every morning. When I wake up in the mornings, almost every morning from my apartment in Podol, I hear a siren going off. But now you see much less people fleeing the country. Quite the contrary, you see people trying to make a shift back, although there's still quite a few displaced within the country. What you do see is that in the early days, many were using trains to escape, and then even walking the border by foot. I still cross the border by foot very often because it's very convenient, a way to get in and out of the country. If you're trying to, make a quick entrance, whether it's at the Mediak border with Poland or driving across the Przemysl border or Krakowicz border, that's how people are, getting in and out of the country because there are no flights going into Ukraine. That airspace, nobody can fly across that airspace. It's very dangerous. And so usually you have to enter through a neighboring country like Poland.
Thank you so much, Dada, for this conversation. And we're all hoping and praying that this ends soon, sooner or later. And I do hope that India can play a role and will play a role on this. But thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for your time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.